Hi, I'm Brocky Murphy, and in 2013, February of 2013, I had a nervous breakdown. A full-on breakdown is when you are completely non-functioning, when you are completely overtaken by anxiety and or depression, and you absolutely cannot function in your life. You cannot eat, and you cannot sleep, and your mind is racing constantly. You literally cannot function. It was frustrating and it was embarrassing to reach out to the doctor, the nurses, even people in my community that just either didn't respond or just changed the subject. The thing that kept me asking for help is that I was terrified and I was desperate. And I knew that I was gonna die if I didn't keep seeking the help that I needed. So the psychiatrist that I was connected with, he described it as a perfect storm. There were emotions and feelings and issues that I hadn't been dealing with for years and years and years that I had just been stuffing down. And this was God's way of kind of forcing that to the surface and saying, it's time for you to deal with this stuff. It's yucky and you don't really want to deal with it, but you have to deal with it. I knew I was perseverant. I knew that if I kept asking, eventually I would find someone or multiple someones that could help me. Well, my husband was definitely a support system. He would say, you just keep moving through it step by step, and eventually you will be through the forest. You will be on the other side. So just keep putting one foot in front of the other. I know people kept saying to me, God has purpose, God has a plan. He's not abandoning you. And I was sitting there thinking, but it feels like he has. It took a really long time. And I don't remember when the moment was that I realized that all of that was behind me, but when I did realize it, it felt really good. I guess I'm amazed that he gave me the courage to get through it when I look back on being in that darkness. He gave me the courage. He gave me the strength to not take my life, to keep going forward.
My name is Rianne Morcott, and I'm a psychiatrist in adult and child and adolescent psychiatry. I'm really hopeful about the direction that we're going to address the concerns and the trends in mental illness. There's this recognition for the first time that not only do we need to figure out what these issues are and how to treat them, but also how do we develop emotional resilience. I'm also very hopeful about a new appreciation and recognition that faith is important both for the emotional healing process and as part of this emotional resilience. And I'm just excited for us as a church. We are ready and eager to participate and provide the resources and outreach for people that are struggling.
I want to start by thanking Brocky for sharing her story. Brocky has been on Christ Church staff for about 5 years, And to the extent that we are honest about the challenges, the mental health challenges that we go through, to the extent that we're telling each other our stories, I think everybody feels a little bit more open, and we have a chance to share a little bit more with each other, and I think we all get better. Let me also say before I get started, if you're surprised to see my goatee, then that's because you don't realize what can hide behind a mask these days. But it also means that you're not watching the daily devotions that I'm doing. Maybe you don't want to, but if you don't know about those, they're available online every morning, a brief 4-minute devotion. Right now we're going through Philippians. So we're continuing and wrapping up this series on mental health. And I want to start by looking at this painting by Vincent van Gogh. He was the 19th century post-impressionist artist, famous for his brushstrokes, famous for his use of green, famous also for the fact that he cut off his ear. This painting, it's called The Raising of Lazarus. It's one of the many biblical paintings that Van Gogh did. This painting is noteworthy for two reasons. One, his prominent use of yellow, which in Van Gogh's art represents God's divine love, and also the fact that he painted himself into the picture. So this is Van Gogh's face. He is Lazarus, the one that God is raising from the dead. If you don't know much about Van Gogh, you may not have known that he was a Christ follower, but he was. At one point, his zeal for God was such that he became a missionary to the poor Belgian coal miners. Another point, he began studying to become a pastor. But his relationship with God, or more perhaps specifically, his relationship with the church was complicated. In this painting, Starry Night, which you could buy for $100 million if you're interested in it. In this painting, we see he uses a lot of indigo, which represents God's sort of infinite nature. We also see that he has yellow, again, symbolic of God's divine love. It's in the heavens, and we see it in the houses, every house in the village. The one place that we don't see representation of God's divine love is in the church building. So Van Gogh had problems with the church. He thought it was full of hypocrites. And he thought that we should be spending our time with the people Christ spent his time with. So the poor, the peasants, and the prostitutes. It could be that the church was full of hypocrites, because the church has always been full of hypocrites, present company included. But it could also be that the reason that Van Gogh was sideways here is because of his mental illness. He was quite open about this. He said that his faith allowed him to be open about his illness and his ongoing suffering. Now, his artwork suggests that much of the time he saw his mental illness and his sufferings through the lens of hope and faith, but not always. There were times when he was clearly deeply depressed and melancholy. If I was going to pick a prayer for Van Gogh, one that sort of represented his angst, his frustration, his ongoing concerns, I think it would be Psalm 13. It's one of the prayers of David, and we're not sure exactly the context in which David was going through problems here, but you hear him giving cry to that. How long, Lord? How long will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy overtake me? How long? Look at me and answer, Lord, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. So since I started by noting that Van Gogh used colors to represent various moods and various points, I would say this psalm, Psalm 13, is colored gray. It's a classic psalm of lament. It's a psalm in which the writer is saying, I'm hurting, The bad guys are winning, and God, you apparently don't care. It seems like a psalm of lament is appropriate today, during a week in which we seem to be turning the corner perhaps on COVID, and things are opening up and we're seeing some progress there. We take a couple steps forward there. But then as a country, we take 10 steps back because of the violence and the senseless killing. Another black man, George Floyd, killed in the hands of a white police officer. It's tragic, it's painful, and it's quite obvious at times like this that our biggest concerns are not viruses outside that might get into our bloodstream. Our biggest problems is our own sin nature. And then today I woke up and one of the first things that I learned was that a young mom at Christ Church was tragically killed in a car accident last night. So how long? I mean, I can relate to David saying, how long? I mean, he repeats it 4 times. How long, how long, how long, how long, how long, Lord, am I going to suffer? How long is this going to go on? So I want us to pause and to recognize the existential cry. David feels alone. Psalm 12, this is Psalm 13 we've been looking at. Psalm 12, David is frustrated and complaining that his friends have left him. Here in Psalm 13, he's frustrated and complaining because God appears to have left him. The skies have gone black. If David were Van Gogh, he would not be painting the heavens with indigo or yellow. He would be leaving them dark. And this is also what we heard last week from Dr. Riken, the president at Wheaton College, who shared about his own experiences with mental illness and the deep depression that he went into. He doubted that God loved him. He doubted that God was listening to his prayers. As I've said, we're not exactly certain the context in which David wrote Psalm 13. David is a king, and so we know that leaders, whether you're the director of the World Health Organization or the governor of a state or the president of the United States, we know that leaders are always going to have people that are lining up against them and criticizing them. And again, as a president, it doesn't matter who you are. Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, Trump. Sherry and I, a few years ago, went to the new Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield. And one of the things that was so shocking to me was there was a path, a little passageway they had you walk down, and what you listened to were the comments of his cabinet members criticizing him, and it was just shocking to me. I mean, Lincoln's like our greatest president, and yet there was ongoing animosity. So perhaps David is just suffering the criticism and the weight of being a leader. Perhaps the enemy that he is talking about is not that; it's more death or evil. But what we get out of him is these cries of loneliness. No one understands me. And it's a cry of anger. It's a cry of being alone. And this is the experience of many people who are suffering with mental illness, whether that's depression, anxiety, bipolar illness, whether that is schizophrenia, whether it's addictions, eating disorders, whatever. There's a lot of people saying, how long, Lord, am I going to be here? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts? Day after day have sorrow. How long will my enemy triumph over me? One of the books that I read in preparation for this series was a book called Wrestling with My Thoughts. And it was a doctor, a young woman, Sharon Hastings, who in her third year of medical school began to spiral down. She went into a deep depression, and it was an ongoing challenge. In the sermon I did initially on Elijah, and then with what Dr. Riken shared, these are two examples of what we would be more inclined to call situational depression. So they both recover. We don't know as much about Elijah, but clearly Dr. Riken shared about turning the corner and the fog lifting. And so there's two types of mental illness, two categories here. One is those that are caused by our circumstances, and that was Dr. Reichen. Everything sort of went wrong, personally and professionally, and he sunk down into this depression. There are other depressions, there are other mental illnesses that are not necessarily caused by circumstances. It's more mental, it's more genetic, or other kinds of challenges. And so I mentioned this book by Sharon Hastings because it makes 2 points, and one I'll end with. But the first point I want to make is that she doesn't get better. Her situation is very hard to read. 10 years she's in and out of hospitals, undergoes all kinds of different treatment regimens, from counseling and prayer. She's on psychopharmacological approaches. She has electric shock. Some of them worked for a little while. It was an ongoing battle, and it was a really hard book to read. But she writes the book as a doctor who can explain mental illness. She writes the book as a person who is suffering from mental illness, who's going through it and sort of describing her experiences. And she also writes it as a Christ follower who is wondering where God is as she moves through this. Now, the book ends on a positive trajectory. She's able eventually to go back and graduate from medical school, but she's not allowed to practice medicine. She dates and she marries, and with the help of her husband, with the help of her aunt, with the help of her church, with the help of her therapist, with a variety of different approaches, she is able to manage, but she remains severely mentally ill. And I just want to be clear that sometimes mental illness is something that people recover from, and sometimes it's something that people do not. This psalm, Psalm 13, is like a typical psalm of lament. Not all of them end this way, but many of them go down, they go into darkness, and then at the very end they sort of pull up. And they're reminded, they're sort of refreshed, and they get a new glimpse of God and his care for them. So sometimes that's our situation. Sometimes we get stuck, and in this psalm we get stuck in verse 4. We don't sort of turn the corner and get to a better spot. And I want to say that I know that some of you may be stuck right now in verse 4. And it doesn't feel to you like God is there. It doesn't feel to you like God is listening to your prayers. And I am sorry, but I want you to stay in there. And I think this psalm is instructive for us. Again, back to Psalm 13, verse 3. Look on me, answer me, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. David is desperate. He's trying to bargain with God, which doesn't really work. God doesn't need anything that we have. But David is sort of pleading, and he's desperate, and he says, hey, look, if you don't help me, then it's going to be obvious to everyone else that you're not a God who answers prayers, because I am going to fall. You're going to look bad if I go down. Now, perhaps your situation right now isn't mental illness. Perhaps it's the loss of a job. Perhaps it's an estranged relationship with a child. Perhaps you're just troubled by our country's intractable racial problems and strife. Maybe it's another kind of chronic illness. But my point today is that this psalm that God gives us, puts in his book for us to pray back, this psalm shows us that where we should go with these deep fears, concerns, anger, we should go directly to God. Pour it out. God can handle it. God can handle our unedited anger. God can handle our cries of confusion and injustice. Too often when we're in these positions, instead of racing towards them, instead of trying to deal with the problem, and instead of trying to deal with God and our frustration with God, we try to just not have to think about it. Perhaps we're going to seek some sort of diversion like Netflix. Which, look, we've got Netflix. I'm not down on some television, but it is an escape. Or perhaps it's some sort of defense mechanism that gets even uglier than that. Perhaps it's an addiction. Perhaps it's alcohol. Perhaps it's something else. And I want to say we should not avoid first and foremost, bringing our frustrations with life to God. So go to him first. In this case, in David's case, he does. And he seems to exhaust his fear and his frustration, and he moves to a good place. He gets to verse 5. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. So in the two previous sermons, and in the ancillary things that we've done, concert and interview with Nee Addy, the Yale the Yale neuroscientist, an interview with John Lennox, upcoming other things that we're doing, we've been trying to make a number of points. So I have briefly defined mental illness and said it's a wide range of disorders that impact our mood, impact our thinking, and impact our behavior. Another point that I've made is that mental illness is more common than we acknowledge. By some estimates, 20% of adults at some point will struggle with a mental illness. Many believe that the mental health crisis in our country is something that is too big for the systems we have in place. Some will complain that we don't actually have systems in place. We have very disjointed treatment options and therapy possibilities, but it's a very challenging system to navigate if you're healthy, let alone if your thoughts are betraying you. And of course, all of that was before COVID. The level of angst and anxiety and mental challenges was at one level pre-COVID, and there's lots of reasons to suggest that it has only gone up. So let me remind you that in this series, I have been trying to make the point that mental illness is a bigger challenge than we might think, not only by using stats, but also by talking about my own family, by bringing in somebody like Dr. Ryken, by referencing number of biblical figures, Saul and Nebuchadnezzar and Hannah and Herod and Naomi and Jeremiah, and also by citing some of the leading Christian figures from the past, people like Luther and Spurgeon, who were open about their mental illness. More recently, it's been Rick Warren and his wife Kay talking about the tragic suicide death of their young adult son, who had suffered from severe mental illness throughout his life. So we started by defining mental illness. I said that it's a bigger issue than many people realize. And then I said, we've got to do something to remove the stigma. One of the reasons that mental illness is such a big challenge is because it doesn't come out into the light. And this is in part because there is personal denial, and it's in part because there is sort of family secrecy. Last week I got a letter from a former student when I was a college pastor. She's out in the West Coast, but she was listening to attending Christ Church online, and she wrote to say, my story is that my grandmother was schizophrenic and that my mother suffered from bipolar illness. And I didn't know that. And then I had another friend call me, also from out on the West Coast. And he shared more of his story. And I knew a lot of his story, and I knew a lot of this particular chapter, dark chapter in his life. What I didn't realize until he shared it this time was that part of that story was related to some time in a mental institution. And the fact that there's shame around that meant that he didn't bring that out. And I apologize to him for not being safe enough for him to share all of what was going on with him. In hindsight, I look back and I say, I should have seen this, but I didn't. And so part of the problem that we have with trying to deal with mental illness is that the stigma is around. I've sometimes wondered how different the church would be if people would just own their problems. Not publicly, not in a large group setting, but in a small group and with friends, if they were open and transparent. and someone said, there's abuse going on in my family, or I've started to drink too much, or I'm not sleeping at all, or I've now started to self-medicate with drugs or other things. If people were more willing to share their story, again, not in a large group setting, but in small groups. This is part of the reason why we're so big about saying you've got to have a small group. You've got to have 2 a.m. friends. You've got to have people that know what's going on in your life so that you can let down. By the way, let me pause here for a second and say, if someone comes to you, one of your friends comes to you and shares about some mental health struggles, perhaps it's their own, perhaps it's that of a child or of a sibling. They confide some unhealthy addiction or a diagnosis of schizophrenia or something else. At that point, you need to move towards them, not away from them. It doesn't mean that you need to fix things. You may need to help them figure out next steps, but maybe all you need to do is just sit with them when it's uncomfortable and say, okay. So one of the challenges I would make is how would you respond to them if they told you they had cancer? One of the people I asked to read my sermon this series before I preached it was a mom whose son has a mental illness. And she wrote and said, I would ask people, don't judge our situation even if it seems odd. Just let the person know. Let the person be themselves and love them unconditionally. Greet them. Sit with them at church. Pray with them. Listen to them. When in doubt, bring a casserole. The comment was, when it came out that her child had a mental illness, she said, all our friends went silent. So mental health struggles need to be something that comes out into the light of day so that the stigma begins to go down. Help break the silence. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things that I would like to say in this series. If it was longer, I would talk about the fact that God has given us some paths that help us manage some of the mental health challenges we face. These are not quick fixes, and they're not perfect fixes, and they're not always going to work. But for most of us, there are paths forward, these spiritual habits and practices of Bible reading and worship and prayer and silence and meditation. Look, I think part of the challenge that we have right now is that we're in a culture that is increasingly characterized by really dysfunctional psychological and spiritual hygiene. And so people are ending up with less and less resilience. And so there are these grooves that God has given us that help us manage some of the challenges that we face. A second thing I would talk about is the upside to challenges and trials. I've done that quite a bit. The third thing that I want to be really clear about is that even Christians suffer from mental illness. I'm so thankful for Dr. Ryken being willing to share his story. And again, he's written a book about this. I have a friend, Dr. Mao, just retired a few years ago from being president of a seminary out on the West Coast. And after he retired, he sent me this video of him giving his testimony as being an alcoholic. He'd been sober for 35 years, but he said this is not something in today's world as the president of a seminary raising money. It didn't feel like I could say I'm an alcoholic because it wouldn't necessarily be accepted. But he said, now that I'm not raising money, I'm going to be really clear. And I'm so appreciative of those people who will step forward and make it clear that Christians, Christ followers, can suffer from mental illness, and that these are not necessarily things that, though well-meaning people will say this, that we can just pray away. I'm going to end this series by speaking to 3 different groups for a minute. First of all, I want to speak to everyone as individuals, and I want to say, Perhaps you have a mental illness. Now, you may know this. You may know that you've got challenges. You may know that you've fallen deeply into an addiction. You may know that you are starting to obsess about things. But you may not want help. I want to say, look, a big first step is accepting what's going on and accepting help. And an increasing part of my day as a pastor is dealing with people who will either not accept that they have a problem or who think that they can fix the problem on their own. And I want to challenge that question. So some of you are struggling and you are aware that you're struggling and you need to be encouraged to accept help. Some of you are struggling, but you don't realize it yet. And look, I spoke last year, did a series called Blind Spots to try and highlight the fact that even if our minds are working as well as they might be, in this fallen world where sin has ravaged all of us, we often have an enormously difficult time seeing ourselves very accurately. Pride and defense mechanisms and sin and other things just blocks that. And it takes a long time of leaning daily into the grace of God to sort of get to the point where I truly get the gospel. The good news is that I'm worse than I could possibly imagine, but that God's grace is greater than I can possibly comprehend. I think it takes a long time for that to happen. So there just may be some disconnects there. And if somebody that cares for you, right, a friend, a family member, if somebody is suggesting that maybe you're not seeing things very accurately, you need to listen to that. Because, look, if you're not seeing things very accurately, you probably wouldn't know it. And so I want to encourage you to have the kind of friends and to have the kind of relationships where someone you know, someone you trust, someone who knows, loves you, can help you figure out if this is a situation for you. So I'm going to say that to all of us. The second thing I want to say is to those of you who are living with someone who is struggling with mental illness. Perhaps they know it, perhaps they don't. Perhaps they're stable, perhaps they're not. Perhaps they're getting treatment, perhaps they're not. Under almost any of those situations, you need more support. And I want the church to be part of what provides that. One of the lines that I underlined the first time I saw it in my preparation for this is that mental illness happens to families. This is not something generally that just affects an individual. It affects a lot of people. And so the 21st century culture we live in, again, is so weak on these kind of support networks and other things. And so I want to encourage you to get help. This is a small group. This is friends. This is neighbors. And we're also, we're playing around with the idea of starting a support group at Christ Church for those who are living with people who have mental illness. And we don't know if we have enough people that will take us up on that, so you can always talk to your campus pastor. But if you go to the Christ Church website and go to the Get Help button in the upper right-hand corner and click on that, you'll see all kinds of support groups, and you can click there and follow through. And we want to provide help. If you give us your name, we'll either get this support group going, and if we don't have enough people, we'll follow up with you to provide help in other ways. Finally, let me say something to the church at large. To all of us collectively, we need to do a better job of loving and caring for those who are impacted with mental illness. Studies consistently show that one of the first places someone with mental illness or a family that has a person living in it that has mental illness, one of the first places they will go is to the church. And this is in part because most recognize that the church just may have a more holistic approach than one particular dimension. An approach that considers the medical, that considers the social, that considers the spiritual, all these things together. So we need to be ready to do a better job. And we're called to do a better job. One of the things that you find in the New Testament as you're reading through it is all these one another statements, these admonitions. We are to love one another, honor one another, be devoted to one another, accept one another, admonish one another, forgive one another, care for one another, serve one another, bear one another's burdens, comfort one another. At Christ Church, I think we do a great job in so many ways of being mobilized to help. Last week, there's, I think, 35,000 pounds of food that was distributed just through one particular ministry. There's lots of things that we're doing right now through our global partners. There's lots of other programs happening at the 4 campuses. There's good things happening. There are many ways in which we step up. But I don't think we do nearly as good a job as we could and should to those who are affected in some way by mental illness. So earlier I said I was going to reference this book, Wrestling with My Thoughts, for 2 reasons. The first reason, this is the young doctor, Sharon Hastings. The first reason was to point out that not all mental illness is situational from which someone gets better. Some people have mental illness that they'll struggle with in various ways for the rest of their life. The second reason is because Sharon Hastings writes and says, I got to a much more stable point because of the love and care, in particular of her aunt, who stayed with her through the entire 10 years, and also because of the love and care of my church. Now, she's quite clear that for a few years she walked away from the church. She gave up on the church. She gave up, in one sense, on God, but she realized that God did not give up on her, and the church did not give up on her. I'm not sure what that would mean for you in particular. I'm not asking that you fix anyone, right? We don't need to be like Job's friends. We just need sometimes to sit and listen and to be there. But we are called to do that. And I want us to be that kind of a community. Let me pray for us. Lord God, I pray that those who can cry out with David, this existential cry of despair, how long, who are feeling like you're not hearing them, you're not there for them. Father, I want to pray that there be a growing sense of your love and care for them. I want to pray for those that are struggling with some kind of mental illness. I want to pray for acceptance and paths forward towards greater health and life. I want to pray for those that are living with somebody who's struggling right now. Father, give them encouragement, and may they find hope in the idea that others will at least sit with them and encourage them and thank them for the hard work that they're doing. Father, I want to pray for us as a church and just across the spectrum, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, single men and women, children, the elderly, across the spectrum. Father, may we be more alert to the challenges that others are going through, more patient, more loving, more wise to know how to help people take next steps. May your church be more what you called it to be. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.